old is Taylor Swift? Okay. 34 years old. I just sometimes I wonder if like I really wonder about her relationship to relationships. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Hmm.
and like her relationship to love. And she's like in a relationship, she's like never actually gotten married, which is like the goal, like the like
Right.
good little girl goal. So I sometimes I wonder if she is like feeling the pinch or if she feels liberated from having to work towards that like success like metric.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's what's fun is all of the, I mean, we all just get to make up all the stories we want based on the lyrics. Like, I know there are, in other albums where she sings one song that's basically like, could you ever actually settle down and be with me? Because my life will always be chaos. So that's a song she wrote. And most people at the time even were recognizing that Joe really didn't like the limelight and that her life was always going to be chaotic and that that was an issue. This is before they broke up. So and then on Midnights, which I know is an album you liked, she wrote the song, Lavender Haze. Like everybody also just feeling the pull and push from the public of what we all want for her, like get married and why aren't you getting married, and her relationship to how all of her relationships get navigated in the public eye and public opinion and
Hmm.
what do they call it in the city town square or whatever, like all of her personal stuff is up for public commentary.
Dude, that makes me want to look up her chart, like her astrological chart. But like, I feel like that's a theme that's up for me right now, which is like where the way someone else is doing something or isn't doing something activates me, And that's
Yeah.
super like, and it's especially come up interestingly enough, like around timing, as in like you should be over this by now, or like your runway for like being in this relationship is over. Like I can see really clearly, like it's in the death throes. Like, why are you hanging on? Like this kind of stuff. So, and then being like, why
uh,
do I care so much?
Totally. No, I think those are really, really, really fascinating questions. And then you get into the whole like how influenced we've been by like the construct of marriage and questioning what it even means and does it even apply to today? Like there's so much, you
Well,
know?
okay, let's talk about healthy versus unhealthy relationships because I feel like that is a massive theme of this album. And I feel like we all kind of have this like semi-conscious of awareness of like what we consider healthy versus unhealthy. And yeah, or like the other kind of theme that I've been encountering in my own personal life is how like when we actually do a relationship audit of like our actual relationships, how they
Mm-hmm.
like usually are kind of subpar when it comes to like our technical like, metrics of what is healthy. So I have found that extremely interesting.
Yeah. Okay. I'm writing down relationship audit because I just love those words. And then the other word I'm going to poke at a tiny bit, which whatever, this is what we do, but is even healthy and unhealthy, like viable or sustainable
Hmm,
is something that I like just because I feel like healthy and unhealthy, even those words are really loaded.
I love that. Yeah.
Um, Whereas viable is like,
Does this even have a
can
chance?
this, yeah, can this live?
Yeah.
Yeah, or sustainable of that idea of like, because I think that there's a lot of songs in here too. Like, it's so easy to romanticize a relationship that ends,
Hmm.
but those dynamics really are they sustainable in the long term of a relationship anyways, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, and I think like it's interesting to consider like the subtle difference between like viable and sustainable. To me, like sustainable is more long term and viable is like just like in this moment, do we have a chance? like
There
like
you go. I
do we
think
have a
those are
chance
really
for the
fun.
next
Yeah,
step even, like
that's right.
yeah, so it's
Is this
interesting.
alive? Yeah. Is this a living relational experience? Like to me, that's viability almost has like that type of feel to it, like alive.
Well, and what's interesting too, I think as long as we're talking about like viability is who and what's viability are we talking about? Because I again just reflecting on the album, um it feels like the viability of the relationship trumps the viability of the two individuals in it. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of like self sacrifice going on to like make the like this third entity viable.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I love that.
yeah. So, I mean, I don't like in some ways I am a little bit appalled at this album, like just how overtly Taylor Swift speaks about like really toxic shit. Like I'm his favorite toy to break or whatever. Like what are the here, let me pull this up on
Hmm.
Spotify so I can look at the lyrics and the songs. Um, so I'm like,
My
I'm not
boy only
sure
breaks
what
his favorite toy.
yes, my boy only breaks his favorite toys. Like, um, let me see. Yeah. Like, but daddy, I love him. All of these, like, I can fix him. No,
Hmm.
really, I can. Um, I can do it
Hmm.
with a broken heart. Like, all of this stuff is just, to me, it feels like so overtly toxic, like almost satirically. And I'm like, what is happening here?
Hmm.
I'm curious if you
Totally.
agree or disagree.
I mean, I think that the relational model in our culture is actually super fucked up, and that these songs reflect our experiences because it's so pervasive. This is how we are relating. And you know that I'm obsessed with James Olivia, and it's because what
Although
I
not
learn about
as much as
relating
you.
a little bit, yeah, basically what I actually felt the stirrings of like things that I'm learning with them before I met them. And it was just that was the first person that I heard like talk, like saying it out loud. But that basically we are kind of across the board extremely codependent. Like that is our culture. And it's so much normalized that we actually, we might recognize extreme pieces of it and we call it out. But this is how we relate. And so I think art speaks to reality. Like that's what art is, in some respects. Like it's a lot of different things, but one of the roles I think art plays is a commentary on what what is happening around us.
I guess my wondering is like, how earnest is Taylor Swift in this album versus how like cynical satirical is she? Because like it feels, and that's part of what I love about this album is that that part feels like so just like, oh, it could go either way, like it's not like this overt um like I am super mad at my younger self for like taking all this shit and like now I'm grown up and
Yeah.
wiser, like like this total like some of it does feel like, oh my god, like these lyrics are so toxic and you actually believe this, like you actually like would be okay with repeating this type of relationship and like not be the wiser for it. So
Yeah. I mean, my personal opinion is that what one of the things that I love about Taylor Swift is that she is extremely wide open. Like,
mm,
and so I think it's both. I think that she's experiencing this as like her maiden self, and there isn't a way to like, there is only initiation. And obviously her whole life has been a series of initiations, given the gift that she has. And I also think that, and I'm totally projecting onto her because this is how I
That's what we
feel
do.
like. That's right. But I feel like I am both in my life and I'm a full human having my life experience, and I am subject to all of the messiness of that. Like I don't get out of it. And I also am above it, witnessing it all and like, wow, this is fascinating. And I can really see what's happening here. But that doesn't like get me out of the experience.
Yeah.
I'm still getting put through all of my paces. And I feel like that's what I personally, in this, I'm a big dork, but I think she's a genius. And it doesn't, um, it doesn't exempt her from all of the bullshit that she's been taught about what it means to be in love. Like I think she's a hopeless romantic, and um, and so she engages in love as a hopeless romantic, and as the complexities. Like we all want to belong to somebody and love. Like we all have bought this idea of what love is, which again I think is not actually what love is. But including her, I think she bought it, and then she's getting fucking thrown around and put through her paces. And yeah, who knows? Who knows if she'll learn what she'll learn, and like, what does that even mean?
Oh man. Well, I mean, I think before we go on much further, and I do kind of want to circle back to this like normalizing codependency. I think that's would be really interesting to dig into. But I just like a lot of these songs, like the titles that I called out, like about the like blatantly like insanely toxic dynamics. I think what makes me feel like really queasy inside is how, yeah, like maybe for Taylor, she's doing the thing which you just said, which is like living it, but also witnessing it. So we do have those two layers, and how so many people do not have that second, like witnessing layer. And they're just like, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be. Like I am fully in the delusion of like, like justifying my relationship in these ways. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think what like extra special hurts is like it was a younger self, but I'm like, what woman is exempt from like participating in at least one of these like insane like toxic dynamics? And same for the dude.
Totally.
The dude is the one, like also
That's right.
so yeah, I think that like that pings, and I'm just like, oh, like we have so much to
I
work on
know.
collectively. Like this is
Totally. It's a
brutal.
pretty searing commentary. We could call it that. You know, like a movie, it might be a dark comedy. Like, did you ever see the movie Don't Look Up?
Mm, yeah, I'm not really a pop culture person except for maybe Taylor Swift. Maybe I did. What's it about?
Okay.
Explain it so we
I
can
mean,
all
it
go.
was it truly was. I'm going to Google just so I can get it. I would call it a searing commentary on how we don't want to engage with reality. And so it tells the story about there's a meteor that's coming to
Yeah,
crush. Yeah.
I think I
And
have seen
it's,
it. Is not to spoil it for anyone, but also I'm probably going to spoil it for everyone. Is the final scene where they're having this weird, stilted, like Thanksgiving dinner, talking about just the most banal shit?
I mean, that's not how I interpret it, but yes, it's a family around a table. Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, how did you interpret it?
I interpret it, it'll make me cry, to be honest with you. So I'm about to tear up because to me, it's like, um, they couldn't stop it. The meteor is coming. We're so off topic, but to me, it
No,
just
it's on
symbolized
topic.
like the surrender, and we're together, and let's just have our meal together. I mean, it's like, that's life. Like, that's life. We're all going to die. So to me, it was very bittersweet of like, who do I want to sit at a table with while I wait for that meteor to hit? Who do I want to spend my days with while I live out my days? Like, to me, it's very poignant. And
Mhm.
yeah, that means we are talking about banal shit. But what else is there? Like, at the end of the day, this is our life experience. And who I really do think about, like, who do I want to sit around the table with while I have my life experience? and this is it. And we're all messy, like, because there was betrayal in there, but at the end of the day, he came back, because you know about the story. Like, he had an affair, but at the end of the day, he came back and he finished. That's who he wanted to have his meal with when they're waiting to die. So, anyways, to me, it was a really poignant and symbolic, because I'm like, at the end of the day, I think the world is kind of going to shit. And here we are. And we still carry on and eat every day and sit around tables together. What else
No,
are you going to do?
I actually think that's really interesting. And one of the things that has come up for me personally is, speaking of like the nuance, like between healthy and viable, for me, there's like a nuance between surrender and submission. And it is, like it's this, younger people won't understand. But I feel like at some point, life is like, you need to slow your roll. Like, there's a ton of powerful shit completely out of your control. And like, you no longer get to ignore that. And then so at that point, it's this really humbling experience of like, it feels like I'm being asked to submit, but surrender is like subtly different. Like surrender, there's choice around it still. There's dignity around it still. There's like a co-creation around it still, but it's not this like, I refuse, like I'm gonna continue to chase my dreams, like I'm gonna, like this is the hill I'm gonna die on. It's like you no longer get to have that type of energy.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
it
you
is,
might, who knows? Like, that's where the internal and external, you could be totally surrendered and say, this is the hill I'm going to die on because it's right.
yeah.
And you could be totally not in surrender. And like, it is that internal, whatever's happening on the inside isn't necessarily,
Well, I think it like to
doesn't necessarily, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, like I am just kind of thinking of like the quality of it is like an acceptance of reality quality, and like
Yeah.
this like gentleness, right? Like this willingness, because you can accept reality and still be like uber pissed about it. But it's like, oh,
Yeah.
like let me just oh, this is making me think of like a yoga teacher training I did where we were talking about like the origin of the term yoga, which is to be yoked. But there's this quality of like being easy in your yoke versus like, thrashing in your yoke. So that's what,
Right.
yeah.
I tend to take it to like those really extreme moments. Like, I'm always testing things out. And yeah, I think of just these bizarre experiences that we find ourselves in, and what would we do? And you think, I don't know, like the actions could vary, but at the end of the day, I do want to be at peace internally, depending on, even if there's actions I need to take that aren't great options that I wish I didn't have to, does that make
Yeah, but
sense?
I think as you're talking, what also is coming up for me is like, I think we overcouple being at peace internally with what's going on externally. And when we decouple
Yep.
that, then there actually is an ability to be at peace internally, like no matter how your life is turning out, or at least there's
Yep.
more stretch there. Like you can still be kind of like, I'm not
That's it.
exactly where I want to be. And I still have this like
Yep.
internal peace.
Yes. That's actually you. I may not have said it well, but that's actually what I'm saying, is
Yeah.
that the state of what's happening inside of you is one thing. And then how, what could be, the whatever is happening on the outside is not necessarily linked. They are
Well,
linked. You said it better than me, but I agree with you. So I'm just going to stick with what you said.
we can, I'm sure it will kind of unwind a little bit more later as well. Okay, so like toxic codependency in relationships, I actually find really interesting because I think there's like a superficial dissonance there with how we purport to live in this culture, which is hyper independently. Um, so I'm curious.
That is okay. And you know what else I think is linked here? So I'm just going to throw this in. is selfish, how much we shame selfishness, but really how selfish we all are in relationship. We're literally using everybody. In the codependent frame, you are using people to feel okay
Well,
in
this
its
is so,
simplest terms.
yeah.
Yep. But we call it not being selfish because I'm catering to you so that you'll like me so that I feel okay. That's not selfish. But if I take care of myself and I don't engage in codependent behaviors, then we call that selfish and shame it. So we have it totally backwards. And I think that goes with what you're saying. But
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking of I had a conversation with my mentor the other day, and I want to be really careful about how I say this because this involves like current clients and current people in my life. But like ultimately, the conversation was around supporting someone and really reaching a place where in my support, I was also feeling like kind of that agitation, that control, like around like, oh, like you know, like I need you to be doing this differently. And I brought it to my mentor and I was like, hey, I'm just noticing this agitation in myself. Like, what do you think about that? And the conversation was really interesting because she was like, you know, as a practitioner, like you do have to watch that activation. As just a human engaging in a relationship that doesn't have the practitioner client framework, you absolutely get to bring your whole self, like your agitation and you know your limitations and your desire to like want to control things. And you know,
mm-hmm.
and if it feels like you can't speak to that person like honestly and directly, um, is that a friendship that you want? And I was like, oh my God, like you just called out all my relationships. Like, I don't know that I have a single relationship in my life where like I'm allowed to bring my like whole complex, messy self and like be direct and honest, like whenever I want to. And I was like, oh, what does this mean? Does this mean that like if we were to try to engage in human relationships from this place of like not suppressing ourselves in certain like even really small ways, like would that mean that I would lose all my people? Like is the only way that in this culture we can have relationships is through like some sort of like self-sacrifice or self-suppression? Holy shit.
I think the answer is in traditional American culture, yes, those are the terms. And it's all built on hierarchies. So even like client practitioner, there's hierarchy there, teacher student, obviously parent child, like these are what are the rules of engagement? What do I have to suppress while I'm in this role, as opposed to relating with skill?
Mm-hmm.
So like, and I don't know that obviously the specifics of your situation, but for example, I can bring my whole self to a client and recognize that they are not a resource for me. And so like that's to me that's like, whereas when I express something at some point relationally, there may be I may be looking to a person to be a resource that's not available to be a resource. And that's how I would think of my clients. Like I don't think of my clients as a resource for me to, I don't know, blah blah. I don't even I could go down a trail.
But I
Where
think
does that take you?
well, I want to, because one thing that you said was this idea of like when we're in a dependent relationship, we're instrumentalizing the other person. Like we're not even treating them like
Yeah,
an actual person. We're treating them like
that's
they're
right.
meeting some kind of need of ours, right? Like,
That's
and
right.
so I
Yep.
thought that was really interesting because my mentor said something to that effect. She was like, you know, if you're in a relationship where you're having to do this kind of like self-suppression and self-censoring, that to me says the other person isn't treating you like a human, like they're instrumentalizing you in some way. And then, you know, like vice versa, right? Like it takes two to tango. So then like
Right.
I am then responsible for looking at myself and being like, to the extent that I'm willing to engage in this dynamic with
To
this
participate in it.
element of like self-suppression, how am I instrumentalizing the other person? You know, like what are they
That's
doing
right.
for me? And so,
That's right. And that's the only part that we can ever really know is what's happening inside of us, and then being responsible with that piece of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's,
Which is, again,
I mean, I think if
it's
we're gonna,
cool stuff.
it's cool stuff. And if we're gonna like just throw out like pragmatic, like free coaching advice on this podcast, which I think we definitely should, to me, that's become a really fun game to play. Like whenever I notice myself like judging another person or I have like some sort of opinion or
Mhm.
idea about another person, it's so fun to immediately like turn it on myself and be like, okay, like where am I doing the same thing that I'm judging this other person for? And
Totally.
not just ask that question, but ask that question with the knowing that the answer has to be like a yes. Like I am doing that in some way. Like I don't get to ask that question and be
Right.
like, no, actually I'm not doing that. Like I ask that question being like, there is 100% probability that this is something inside me that needs some work.
Yeah, totally. So I am, people, I don't know that you and I have ever talked about Byron Katie. I know that a lot of people have, their views. I love her. And one of my favorite quotes of hers is, "It's only yourself you're ever dealing with." And I love that. I come back to that time and time again because all of my relationships exist inside of me. All of my stories, all of my feelings, all of my thoughts, like it's I'm the one who is creating them. That's not to say that other people aren't impacting my life, but I am a participant and I am ultimately the perceiver. I'm the one who's experiencing it. And so I don't know, I just love that idea of always considering how am I co-creating an experience that I don't want, or obviously how do I co-create experiences that I do want.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like one of the frameworks that I appreciate astrology for is this idea that I'm not going to say that this is like entirely what relationships are about, but I also like for this thought experiment want to say that like this is entirely what relationships are about is literally
Yeah.
to just come into our lives to show us something about ourselves or to create some kind of
Hmm.
like personal development inside ourselves. Like it, because I think
Yeah.
so many of us think about relationships as like, oh, I'll never be complete like without this person, or like we're such a
Yeah.
complementary match. Like he's all the things that I'm not. But like in reality, relationships are like truly just a vehicle for self-development. And then like any bonus stuff you get, great. Obviously, like we're social animals. But to like all of these like breakup stories about like, oh, like I'll never be the same without them, or like, like I'm
Yeah.
just like, whoa, like
Yeah.
it's so for me, like with relationships too, and I actually had like like let me just be vulnerable about my own personal relationship life. I've kind of had this trajectory from like, my 20s into now I'm in my early 40s, but it was like I had this idea in my 20s where like finding the perfect relationship felt like really important to me. Like it really felt like a core authentic desire. Like for some reason, like I could see that other people weren't as into relationship as me. But it was always really confusing to me. Like, oh, like how can they be okay being like alone or on their own? Like for me, it just
Right.
feels like relationship is so important. And and then going through this phase where I was like, okay, like this relationship ended. I'm going to start dating again and kind of like justifying, like not having to take some like alone time or like personal time, just being like, oh, yeah, no, like, it's been over for a while. Like I'm actually pretty healed. I'm ready to jump back into the dating pool. And then going through a period where I was like, this is actually kind of weird that I feel like I need to start dating like immediately after like a
Hmm.
relationship ends. Like, I think there might be some like compulsivity or addiction here. this is wild. And then being like, okay, like now even though it feels really uncomfortable and I can like justify all the reasons it's okay to start dating again, like I'm intentionally like going to practice being single. And then slowly being like, you know what? I can actually see how having that desire for a relationship and that like dependency on a relationship is problematic. And maybe I need to like, like, and I can kind of see myself like pendulating too much in the opposite direction of like, oh, like I'm never going to find someone. Like I'm totally okay being alone. In fact, like it feels really dangerous to seek out a partner because like the relationship always goes south and like, I just can't trust myself or like
Mm,
there's no good man out there. Like if I'm going to be in a cis het
right.
relationship. And then kind of being in this energy of being like just really closed off to like any kind of like romantic relationship. Um, and then like just really recently having just some like encounters and engagements like socially, like not on dating apps, but just like out in the wild where like with a practical stranger, like but like feeling like oh interesting, like a part of me is feeling like flirty or like what's this about, and then immediately being like okay, it can't be about this other person. Like, I don't even know them. Like, it's obviously not about them. So, like, what is it about me in my life that is causing this, like, feeling of like, oh, like, I do feel like a little bit of attraction. Oh, like, I could, if I allowed myself, I could, like, fall for this person. Like, what is going on there?
Yeah, that's fun. I mean, again, I think of like you're the participant and you're above it. Like that's what you're describing is like you're totally in it as this human, knocking around, and there's this part of you that's above it all, watching it, going, "Huh, what do I make of this?"
I
You
think that's
know?
so important in relationship. I think,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's important in all areas of life. And I almost think of it as having like two pairs of glasses that you can take on and off. Cause I think of like entering into a relationship and falling in love and like how
Mm-hmm.
just that is like the most intoxicating feeling in the world. Like it is such a powerful drug and it feels so
Yeah,
good. And like to deny yourself that is just like, why? But to be like
right.
completely like, this is my only truth right now and not be able to like every once in a while, like peek around the curtain and be like, there's a yellow flag or like, proceed with caution. Like let yourself enjoy this, but like, have some like check-in stations along the way. And to be able to do both
Yeah.
without sacrificing one for the other is so critical.
Yeah, it's that ability, like when you say problematic, what I hear is there are consequences that you don't wish to engage with, that you feel like there would be other ways to engage with people that have consequences that you prefer or more consequences that you prefer. But one of the things that comes up for me when you're describing this process is I think it's a great example of how we have so narrowly defined how to meet needs. So I can really relate to like obsessed. I don't know, you didn't actually go this far to say this, but honestly, I was obsessed with finding a boyfriend starting in like third grade.
I think that would be
It's
fair.
all I thought about. Yeah. And so my whole life, I just wanted to, I was constantly daydreaming, constantly on the lookout, so important to be, and then to have this person, and then, oh, am I going to marry this person? And then, ultimately get married. And then I was married long term, you were too. And then I did the same thing when I broke up with my husband, very, very quickly started dating, very quickly entered into relationships again. And at the end of the day, what has stopped me short and really like reined me in were encountering consequences to that I don't want, and realizing I can be more intentional about this. Now, the part that I really get excited about is we elevate this romantic love and it being the be all end all. But what if we had new relational templates where maybe you are having romantic escapades here or there that are thrilling and fun, and maybe you have other people that are your ride or die, and maybe they're not people you marry, and maybe they are people you snuggle on a couch with, like whatever. Like at the end of the day, just like you said, we're social beings, but we have said these are the constructs that you're allowed to have, and this is the narratives and the stories that we're going to weave about what that looks like. And you grow up and you get married and you have babies and you live happily ever after, like, and it's man and wife or whatever, you know what I'm saying?
Mm.
And nowadays we're starting to, there is like this trend, and I've heard of this word and I'm not a student of it, but just a friend of mine, but like relational anarchy, where we're saying we're really starting to question, what does human love mean? And what does relating mean, and community care? And maybe our old models aren't actually that great. And I say that with tongue in cheek, like I could laugh hysterically. Maybe our models, our current models aren't working for us. It's like, look around, we're not doing well.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too. Like, I think everyone can look around and say, like, we're not doing well and be like late stage capitalism or like politicians instead of like how we relate. Like, let's take a look at like
Mhm.
our networks and our like, how we're in relationship to
Yeah.
each other. So I think that's really
Yeah.
I think that's actually more the crux of it. And I think late stage capitalism like contributes, like politicians contribute for sure, but like um
Well, it contributes. You and I have talked about before, like even in just in the simple way of like to have babies and to work, and how do you division of labor and paying for homes, like how you don't even have time to relate if you have to have three jobs, which is true for many people. So like,
yes. Yeah.
and then what our work requires, how many hours a day are you gone, and what do you have left when you come home to relate, if everybody's exhausted and everybody's and then we all have to live in our own homes, so we're all living, paying so much money, like, but if we don't have relational skills and we don't know how to be with each other, then we all need our own homes,
So
you
it's
know? So it's
interesting.
so
True.
fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I want to go back to like our trajectories of like how we move through relationship. Because I think one thing that came up for me as you were describing your trajectory is there came a point in my life where like I understood myself. Like it wasn't so much about like, oh, I just have this desire that I'm blindly going to chase to be in relationship. At some point, I began to understand, like you said, the consequences of entering into a relationship and how that affects myself. And what I began to sense in relationships is like anytime I enter into like like an extreme romantic relationship or like this, like, traditional monogamy, like partnership, um, I have to be less of myself. And at some point I was like, I am no longer okay with that. Like, I am no longer okay with like being less of myself. And what would it look like and what would it feel like where like a relationship actually allowed me to be more of myself? Um,
Mm-hmm.
like where literally in this relationship, I could be more of myself than I even was completely single. Like, is that
Yeah.
possible? Is that what would that feel like? Because like literally I can't safely say that like, I mean, maybe with the exception of like a mentor relationship here and there, where like a mentor really like called me into more of myself. But like, I'm like every single relationship I've had has ultimately resulted in me really having to like censor myself or like, abandon myself in certain ways. And there
Yeah.
came a moment where I was aware of that and I had enough of a sense of self and like respect for self and like just like having fun with myself that like that no longer felt. And then that really loosened the grip that like this desire had
Right.
on me to be with someone in this like perfect relationship.
Yeah. And now with this new way of being where you are just going to be you, now it'll be fun to see, people will be attracted to you in that, and that therefore it attracts a different type of person that doesn't require that of you, that actually loves it.
It will be interesting to see. I mean, right now, all I have felt is like a total dearth of like potential partners. Um, or I have felt, kind of like this like really interesting, like, um, yeah, just like falling in love energy, but it's like so weird because I'm like, I actually haven't really like known this person. Like, where is this coming from and what does it mean? Like, and I don't know
Yeah,
that I fully have the answer there. It's like it's a very fun energy. I'm like, oh, like I get to be flirty, but I don't know what it
that's
means.
right.
Um,
Well, that's just it. I mean, okay, so let's go there with Taylor Swift because I think that that's at the end of the day, we're all having experiences. So you're having this sensation that you enjoy, and then you're trying to name it. You're trying to, what is this?
mm,
And that's what we're all doing. We're trying to make sense of it. But what if it just means that you're having sensations that you enjoy, and you'll see, and then when they stop being enjoyable, you can move away.
oh, it's so interesting. I mean, it is that question of like, this needs to mean something. I need to do something with this. That's the correct thing? So it's
Mhm.
wild to be like, oh, I can just have this sensation, register it as pleasurable, and not have to like, categorize it.
Yeah, and you get to just pay attention and notice how that's working.
Well, I want to make it mean something. I want to make it mean
I
that like
know.
I need to do some like self-development or like to like go out in like my life and find this energy. So it's really interesting. Um,
Yeah, we so how do I like create more of it, or is that what you mean?
yeah, well, it's interesting because I want to make it mean that there is like a deficit in my life, and this is like trying to signal like where the
Mm,
deficit is. Isn't that interesting? Well, that's it. That's like my primary. Because normally, okay, so like old 20s Celestina would make it mean like I'm falling in love, like this is the person I need to pursue.
right.
So like I no longer want that meaning, and I no longer think that meaning is correct. But now I think what I'm trying to make it mean is like, oh, there's like this is a message to you about like what you
Mm,
need to do or improve or fill in or like what
yeah,
energy or energetic you need to draw out of yourself or your own life,
yeah.
which is still kind of, now that you're like engaging me around it, it's a little like mean, right? It's like, oh, you need to like go out
Hmm.
and improve, or like I'm like, maybe I could just be flirty in it and then just leave it. Like not,
Maybe. Yeah.
maybe
I mean,
nothing
I
needs to
think
do with
that
my life.
yeah, what comes up to me is the gravitational pull towards certainty. Like that's where ultimately meaning is about. It's like there's some kind of safety, there's a lure there that
Mm.
if it means something that I would know how to make sense of it versus like, okay, let's look at little kids. They're just on the playground having an experience and they're just loving the experience. I don't know, I kind of want to be more like a kid, but I think that there's a grief there in recognizing that I could then be vulnerable to loss that I don't see coming, for example. And then would that be a consequence I'm willing to engage with to have the pleasure
Well,
of
I
this
mean, that is
experience?
interesting because I think about that with my kids a lot. Like I think about, how they, yeah, like exactly as you said, like you go to a playground, you like have the time of your life with strangers, and then you're like completely okay never seeing these people again. You're just like literally the
Right.
moms will be like, say bye to your friends, like knowing full well that this was like a random encounter
That's
on the
right.
playground. So like that kind of depth of like, I don't even know if intimacy is the right word, but like that depth of like presence and engagement. And then
Mhm.
like, 'cause I sometimes wonder, like, I wonder, like, my kids are too little to like be able to fully articulate this, but like, do they ever miss those kids? Like, do they ever want like to see those people again? Or are they like, is it just totally like goldfish brain where they're like, this was magnificent? They go to sleep and they wake up and they're just like, zero
Yep.
attachment to the past.
Yeah. I don't know. I think, again, this is like our adult brains kind of judging or trying to value
Totally.
what's better or worse or whatever, instead of just like, it's part of the human experience is that you're going to have these encounters with people you don't know that could be actually really special and wonderful. And they could be, and it ends. And that's it.
I feel like Taylor Swift should do an album around that particular experience. Cause like I think we've also all
Mm,
had that experience of like just this like random connection, but like not getting the person's number
yep.
or even like getting the person's number and it just kind of not being the same or
It
what you
wasn't ever meant to be a thing. Yeah. Like,
uh,
okay, so I'm going to, this is kind of going back, steering back. So what I really love about Taylor Swift is I do, I love to play with story. And I think that's a very human thing. So it's like, while on the one hand, I try to be very particular about the stories that I tell myself and the stories that guide my life. I want to be super intentional about that. But at the end of the day, they're still just stories. Like there is not a truth. But I love to play with stories to the extent that it makes my like human experience like richer. And so like mostly I'll find myself in the song. Like what does this song remind me of in my life? Like where can I relate? And there was a guy that I dated for 6 months after I got divorced. He's like the first boyfriend I had. And according to the world, it was a disaster. And it was not healthy. And it was not like I could paint such a shame based story for you right now. I could, and it would be true of how gross it was. And I could also paint such a romantic picture of it. And I, I love the romantic picture. Like I was just thinking the other day, like I did dangerous things when I was with him. I like went dirt biking and crashed my dirt bike and rode dirt bike on like a highway. Like what on earth? Like terrible ideas, but it was this little I got to know myself as a different person in that relationship as like sensual and sexy in ways that I didn't know that I was. And like I'm going to tell you this funny story because I think it just symbolizes this. He bought me these net stockings, and I had like little, just like little short shorts that are in style. They're like little cut off denim shorts. And one day we were going to go golfing out in this like hick little town we were staying in. So, and he's like, I want you to wear those net leggings underneath your short shorts to go golfing. And I'm like, sure. Like, what do I care? Like, it's just silly and ridiculous. But like, and I just think you could look at that and be like, that's so gross. Or you could, but my story is that I got to have like a 6 month crazy adventure. And the point of all of that, like that's where I see myself in some of these songs where she's just immersed in this really kind of a fantasy. And it was fun while it lasted. And then it might end in this disastrous way and you have a broken heart, you nurse yourself back together. But at the end of the day, when it's all tied up, you go, I love the version of Molly that didn't care what my friends thought because all of my friends were like, what on earth are you doing with this guy?
I love
And literally, for the record, I messaged his sister at one point and literally said words like, my love. Oh God, I'm so embarrassed to say this out loud, but like basically, like, I'm kind of magical in my love. And I really like basically, I can fix him.
that's so funny.
So I say all of that just to be like, who's to say that was a bad experience?
Oh
Who's to
my God.
say?
I just love how you like unshamed this whole album and this whole oh Molly, I love that you brought that story in. I really like I want to stay with it a little bit longer. So one thing you said that I really think is beautiful to reflect on is I got to know myself as a different person in that relationship. And I do think like that is the magic of relationships is it will
Mm-hmm.
constellate like a different expression of us. Like that person will pull something out of us. And it really does. I'm like not quite ready to let go of my idea that like we could have come to that energetic on our own. This is like me.
Hmm.
But I also do think there is something like indubitably magical about the way that it happens in relationship. And I do think that that's like when we lose a relationship or like have to end a relationship, part of we think like we're mourning the other person, but we really are mourning like the now inaccessibility to that version of ourselves or like what came out of us when we were in the presence of that other person. Um,
Totally.
yeah. And I also love this idea that every relationship has so many different facets and different stories and different ways of telling it. You know, like you could do this totally like shame-based, like the fuck was I thinking story, or you could, there is absolutely a story of like, you know, like this bad girl, like exciting type, you know, like, so
Totally.
yeah, I I think what's really interesting is humans do have this tendency, speaking of like making meaning and like wanting control, that when we have like multiple stories around one thing that aren't congruent, we will choose one and then like completely discard the rest instead of like being able to
Hmm.
hold like all the different versions and all the different. So I love this idea of having like a multiplicity of stories for like any given like events in your life or even, you know, like for your evolving identity. Um,
Totally. I think it is one of my favorite parts about this album is that we do get these little windows. It's like my imagination tells me she wrote this song during one part of the relationship where she could see things this way. And then obviously she's writing this song after the fact. But that is how it is. Like, we don't know how things are going to unfold. And it doesn't change the fact that we had a wonderful experience at some point in the relationship, even if it was an hour, you know,
yeah.
at some point there was something magical. But then, and also just to, I do think people are mirrors. That's why at the end of the day, it is only me I'm ever dealing with because I am the creator of the story I tell. And I am when I'm with another person and they bring out this part of me, it is that they are enabling me to see a new part of myself, just like you were saying.
Mm.
And that's I don't know. I think to let go of that, most of us are pretty attached to our identity. So when we have a relationship that opens that wide, like blows the doors off of who we thought we are, we can think it was them.
Or it gives us access to something that was either consciously or unconsciously like aspirational, you know, that like we've always
Exactly.
wanted to be
Yep.
and like for whatever reason never felt like we had access to.
Totally. I think that's one of the biggest, again, downsides to, I would call it a downside to the constructs that we have, the parameters that we've put around these different relationships and what everything means is that there's more attachment to you being who you're supposed to be in this role.
Hmm.
Um, and so there's less room for you to actually just be a whole person who has endless expressions.
Well,
But
that
not only do I attach to who I'm supposed to be and a very narrow view of that, but I project that onto other people too. Like, well, that's not Celestina. It's like, what?
yeah. No, it's really interesting. I mean, I think we've all had the experience of either someone telling us like you're not acting like yourself at all. Like this is crazy. Like don't you see? Or like being that person like that this is not who she is. Like what's going on with her? You know, like especially around like
Right.
infatuation and obsession. And it's really interesting
Yeah.
to think about like, well, what if that is actually an authentic expression of that person? You know, like what if who they are now, like under this spell, is actually like we have to accept that as like as real and true. Um, what does that
Totally.
mean? But also, you know, it's
Totally.
interesting because like as you were talking about other people being mirrors for us, I did have the thought, like, I was like, I think people are mirrors, but like not exactly, because it's always like a little bit specific, right? Like some people will mirror some things and other people will mirror other things. And I just had the thought, and I genuinely don't know the answer. Like, is it possible to find a mirror that actually does mirror our wholeness as opposed to just like different facets and different pieces? Like, is that even the goal? Is that even realistic? Or is it like and this is why, like, this is why we all end up having many different relationships through our lives, is because each relationship is this mirror, but this partial mirror, or like this very specific mirror.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you, there's a death. I think it goes back to childhood trauma. So children do need other people. Like we are literally dependent on the adults that care for us. And most of us have enough trauma that we did not like mature. Not to shame that, but just to like acknowledge like that there is a way of like being an adult where I don't need you to be different because I actually can take care of myself. And so, to the extent that we are bringing, if I am dependent on you and you are showing me a mirror of me that I really don't like, but I can't leave because I'm dependent on you, now I need you to change the mirror or blah, blah, blah. Does that make sense? I know I kind of just, it made sense in my own head to say that right there.
Well, I
But the
think,
point I'm
well,
trying to make, yeah, is
uh,
that it can be there's a grief to realizing I actually am on my own. That's where I was really going with that. That as an adult human, I can search for that person to be my person so that I'm not alone. But again, at the end of the day, they die before me. So to come to terms with the aloneness of the human experience, even though you're not really ever alone, there is a journey you travel alone, just being you. That's where I was trying to get with that. Does that track? So when you accept that other people cannot be that any full, they cannot provide that fullness for you, I guess is where I was going with that. That mirror, nobody will ever be able to do that for me. And I'm okay. I don't need that.
so yes, I agree with you. And also, it's really interesting as you were talking, for a minute, I thought you were saying, and maybe you are saying this, or like what my brain handed to me was like, we can only, because like childhood trauma and thinking of like traumatize people because like we are then stuck in our own trauma and only able, it's
Right.
such like a protective way and like a childish way of engaging with the world. So I had this thought of we can only mirror wholeness to the extent that we are whole and the other person feels
Mm-hmm.
safe enough to be whole. And so maybe it
Yep.
is possible theoretically, but also in this like broken culture where we've really only begun working with trauma in a way that we can like be conscious of it and try to like, not just be caught in the
Yeah.
throes of our own trauma. It actually isn't possible. And what you said is true, which is like, most people are just so broken and so imperfect that they are only going to be able to like mirror certain things through these like
Mm-hmm.
trauma filters, right? And we have to be
Right.
okay with that. And we have to understand that like the goal isn't to get wholly mirrored by someone, but to like create our wholeness ourselves.
That's right. That's right. And baby, that's where, again, to the extent that I'm whole, even if somebody across from me is mirroring to me, they're mirroring from their perspective that I'm not because they don't have that worked out. It doesn't change that I feel whole. And I'll just wrap that story. The reason that guy and I broke up, this actually felt really wonderful to kind of ride the course of a relationship and actually earn my self-trust that I wouldn't actually participate in relationships where um, that I had actually learned some really powerful lessons and I wasn't going to stay in a long-term relationship that wasn't working for me. And so when it, you know, as any relationship does, like the shine wears off and you start to deal with real life things. And I went to him basically saying, I have a problem. This isn't working for me. I'm really open to lots of different ways that we could engage with this. Here are some of my ideas. I'm open to your ideas. And where he was able to meet me was, why do you have to be so difficult?
Mm.
And I was like, wait, I'm not being difficult. I totally accept this is who you are and this is what you like. And this is who I am and this is what I like. Like, let's figure this out. What the fuck is wrong with you? And then it was like, okay, well, I guess this isn't going to work. But my point is, had I still had the lens that something was wrong with me, I would have believed that reflection.
Mm.
And because I didn't, I could just sadly, because I was really sad at the time, accept that it wasn't going to go forward and be with my grief around it because I was not willing to participate in conversations where there's something wrong with me if I have a problem.
Well, and I mean,
So go
yeah,
ahead.
that to me, the crux of things then is around like relationship and wholeness is like, if I am fully in my wholeness and you are fully in your wholeness, we are going to be different because every person is
That's
unique.
right.
If we are like each
That's
fully
right.
in our wholeness, we are going to have to deal with some kind of friction or some kind of like sense of being alien to each other. And if we
Yep.
want both relationship and wholeness, then the work has to be like being okay with how we're different, right? Instead of making that a problem or like,
Celebrating it.
yeah, well, and I think where like as I reflect on my own relationships, where that really becomes difficult is like if your difference begins to feel like the way that I'm different is bad, or the way that I'm different is interfering with the way that you're different.
Yep. And that's what will require you to stand in your own wholeness. And that's where I think if things get messed up is if I'm dependent on that person, now we have a problem. But if I'm not, we're okay. Because I'm going to celebrate that you have a problem with my difference. That's you, even if it hurts. And I'm the implications of that are how close can we be? If you're if a person isn't available to if somebody's going to yell at me about our differences every day, I'm not going to live with them, even though I might really love them and appreciate them, and I appreciate their perspective. And functionally, it's not going to work for me because I'm not going to live with somebody that yells at me. And I'm being silly, like that's a silly example, but
Well, no, but I think like the how functional it can be is a really kind of bittersweet piece, you know, because like so for example,
mm-hmm.
this is just like an example, like there's two people and their wholeness, it's like you know, one person is like a night person and one person is a morning person. And you know, like they even try really hard to like not shame each other. Like everyone understands it's a
Right,
preference. And also, you know, if you live in a tiny studio apartment together, even if you're not shaming each
right,
other, like it becomes an issue just in terms of like
that's right,
pragmatically, we're now kind of like
that's
interfering
right,
with each other.
that's right. And so you get to come together. How do we show regard? How do we make this work and what are our options? And we're all limited by there's limitations, and which limitations am I willing to engage with?
Hmm.
It's and taking responsibility for my decisions. So like in my case, because I do think it helps to have like examples, and you and I haven't talked in so long, like there's actually a lot of, I'm laughing at this conversation because there's a bunch of like updates that you and I don't have from the last time we had just a personal phone call.
Yeah.
But like my husband and I live in different houses, and he might want to live together, or I could want to live together, and one of us may not. And that means that each person has to show up with what they're willing to do and what they're willing to offer. And that might not work for the other person. Like, and it isn't incumbent upon one person to deny being a night person. And that's the realities. And so, what does this look like? How do we, what does the way that we relate look like that shows regard for both of us? And that's just reality.
It's so interesting because like I feel like a lot of times the low hanging fruit in like, okay, like I get to be my whole self, you get to be your whole self. There's like inevitable friction is actually
Mm-hmm.
like the low hanging fruit. The obvious solution is like, well, we just take more distance, you know, like, and
Mm-hmm.
I think even now as I'm saying this, like I have pathologized that in my own relationships and also when I've suggested that to clients. You know, I've said like, well, you know, like maybe if we had like more like relational skill or like if we all, you know, were raised in like more like relational complexity, like we would have like a more creative solution. But for now, like, you know, to the extent that this is sustainable, like let's just go with it. Like, oh, it's like unsexy and like maybe not skillful. But I'm like, oh, like, well, maybe it is skillful. Like maybe like kiss, you
Mm-hmm.
know, like keep it simple, stupid. Like what
Yeah.
if like this is just my old idea about relationships pathologizing the fact that like relationships where we're both whole like innately include some amount of distance and maybe like more distance is actually really okay to the extent that you know we're
Yeah.
allowed to have
Does
it.
it work for you? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that you're always evolving. And at some point it could work for you. And at some point it may not. Like that's okay too. But who are we asking? Are we asking other people to be different to accommodate us, which in that case we are like objectifying them?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Or are we objectifying ourselves? And that's where I do think that's the whole capitalism thing you and I have talked about. Is like, this is, there is nuance in there, because I would never shame somebody who is, for example, staying in a marriage, making the deliberate decision to stay married for economic reasons,
Yeah.
but own it, and we don't have to shame it. And if you can agree to a partnership that works with both people, and you can do so without resentment, because you can own that this is the decision that I'm making, and I'm
Yeah.
going to take care of myself in these ways. But the truth is, sometimes I might have to live in a situation that isn't ideal, because those are the consequences I'm willing to engage with or not engage with, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, I do think it's important to add a caveat, and I do remember us having a conversation about this, you know, where I think I shared with you that like I felt like I couldn't share my truth in a relationship, but I also wasn't, it wasn't a relationship that I could like just discard because it wasn't like, you know, this ideal relationship. And we had the conversation around
Totally.
like, yeah, like it's actually again, it isn't this black or white thing where like the only relationships you should ever pursue or engage in are the ones where you have this like totality of freedom to like be, you know, your full self and like, but there are some relationships that are going to require like intentional like self-suppression or like intentionally like some maladaptivity. And as long as you're conscious of that and okay with that and like really clear on why you're doing that, then like, yes, like let's unshame that. Let's let it be okay. Cause that is the reality of being like a biologically social, you know, like a creature that
Right.
cannot exist completely on its own.
Totally. I mean, we do this all the time. I drive a car because of where I live, and there are implications to car ownership. And I recognize when I drive a car, I'm doing that, and I'm still driving a car. Like, we live in the constriction of a world and global. I mean, I bought a dress at Old Navy last week, you know?
How dare you?
I know. I mean, I'm not like, it is like, it's that. that paradox of like, I have financial limitations. I knew I could get a quick dress there. Go into a thrift store. Actually went to a thrift store first, didn't find anything, needed a little something. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
Totally.
this is reality. This is what we're doing. And the same thing is happening. This is how it is. Like, there's not perfection. Again, that's all in the standard of judgments. Like, what am I making this mean? Um,
Well, I think what I really love came out of this discussion was this like the multiplicity of stories you're allowed to have. Like you're allowed to be both the person that shops at Old Navy for convenience, and you're also allowed to be the person that would like rather shop at a thrift store and actually went to a thrift store. And like, it's this weird thing because I'm very similar. I'm like, I understand that I should shop secondhand. And in some ways that's fun. And in other ways, like it's very like it's much more metabolically intensive than just like going into a Target. And like sometimes
right.
like we just don't have the energy and it's okay.
It is. And that's where it's
Tired.
your values.
Yeah.
It's your values. It's your commitment. And there's a cost one way or another. And it's today, these are the resources I have.
Mhm.
These
Exactly.
are the needs I have. These are the available resources. And um, these are my commitments. These are my values. Um, it's fascinating. I just think it's a fascinating experience being a human.
Well, this word like hypocrisy comes up, right? Like if I have values and I like intentionally do something that doesn't match my values, like as opposed to like, hey, I still have these values and I just like, I literally like we just cannot be perfect all the time. Um, yeah. So I love this conversation too, because we didn't talk a ton about Taylor Swift, but it has resulted in me like really reframing this album. Like I went into this conversation wanting to be like, oh my God, like human relationships are so fucked up and like Taylor Swift is so fucked up. And like, I mean, maybe not to like that extent, but just being like, wow, like these are some really toxic like relationship dynamics.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and I am just coming out of this conversation with like just a lot of grace for Taylor Swift and also a lot of grace for these relationship dynamics. And even like a part of me is like, oh, like I can see like permitting these for certain reasons. Like I can
Mm-hmm.
I can actually see like, oh, like maybe we don't need to like completely scorn and vilify and try to like remake and like destroy the fact that this happens. Like maybe like this can happen and there actually is some like as weird and as shameful as one story is, there's actually a story where this was like really important and really beautiful. So
Totally. I think this is where, in the world of judgment and having to make everything fit into a narrative, um, you can, I can easily switch from this is good and this is bad, but it's the same web. And then if I can be like, oh, this is a web, I can kind of like feel some spaciousness around it. Like, and that's why I don't prefer. I think it's my favorite thing about story and narrative and playing with it is realizing that certain stories, I'm still stuck in them and I don't want to be stuck in it. It's like, it's just constricting. To judge that as bad, then I have to be good. And it's just not that simple.
no, well, and I think, again, if the listeners want something pragmatic from this podcast, I think we've just kind of happened upon a really creative way to deal with that, which is you don't have to discard the first story, but you get to like tell yourself another story about the same thing. and then hold them
Yeah,
both and just see what happens. Like you don't have to drop this one, so it's like risk free. But like what happens when you try to tell a different story? And then what happens when you try to hold both stories?
totally. I think that's a really powerful exercise to do. And actually, I've been thinking lately, um, yeah, it would be a really fun exercise to take a certain story that we're telling a certain way and challenge yourself to tell it three different ways, to
Mm,
totally switch it up. And it's the same thing as, again, Byron Katie's turnarounds, but it's, I do find it so much more expansive when I can realize there's a different way to tell this. And I usually land on the story that to me it's serves as a resource for me in some way, because I just don't see the benefit of having a story that reinforces um, constriction. I just don't need any more of that. So
yeah. Yeah. And I think, like it is even okay. It's even very liberating if you don't like have to pick the most resourceful version. Like just let all the versions exist and that's a resource. Like that's spacious.
totally,
Um,
that can be totally spacious. Yeah.
so
Are we about done? Are you wrapping? I don't know how long you wanted this to be.
yeah, we are wrapping because
Okay.
I don't want it to be too long because podcasts that are too
Yep.
long, I think, turn people off. So I don't know. Yeah, this is
Totally.
a good
Okay.
time for closing remarks. And if you have to go and if you want to let the people know about yourself or if there's something else that you want to say, I think this was
Mhm.
really fun, as always, with you, Molly,
So
conversation.
fun. So fun. Okay,
Um,
well, I'm going to close with a story because this is one of my favorite stories. So, this guy that I told you about, I spent the whole summer crying about him, which honestly was to me a way to be with the grief of losing my marriage 6 months later. Like I had more resources to be with it. So, I cried the whole summer. It had this guy's name on it, but really, I think it was just a lifetime of grief. At the end of the summer, there was this brief little opportunity that maybe we were going to get back together, and we were supposedly going to have dinner, and of course I had like worked it all up. Well, then he did a flaky thing and didn't like, kind of postpone dinner, and then I was like, it kind of woke me up of like, what am I doing? This is not going to work. So I took off out of town by myself. I went camping in the mountains by myself in this totally remote place, and it proceeded to like have a fire and really like I'm there to do work. And the next morning I just was filled with delight, and I dug a little grave and I wrote my story of him on this paper and I buried it. And then I took a picture like, here lies, I think I maybe put the name, but I was so delighted because I realized, I just like her story, I made him all up. Like the person I was in love with was my creation, and
mhm.
I hadn't lost anything. Like I still have my imagination. I still have all of these good qualities that I was projecting onto him. And I get to go and keep playing like with future relationships, and I can bring all of this. But it was such a cool moment for me. And it reminds me of Taylor Swift's song, Guilty as Sin, where she says, like, what if he just wrote mine on my inner thigh in my mind? Like, really, these relationships exist inside of us and we can't really lose them. They're ours. Our stories are ours. The interpretations we want to make of them are ours. And that was just such a powerful, like, pivotal moment for me to really, um, to realize, like, nothing had been lost. So
Mm,
that's my little ending story. But that there's this beautiful process that needed to unfold on like this stage of life. And that's what we're here for. That's what I
yeah,
think we're here
well,
for, is to have an
and
experience.
it's so interesting because I'm just even thinking of like Taylor Swift as a storyteller and as like these lyrics like are her process and her storytelling. And I think what is really coming out of this, you know, is like humans are someone actually I follow on social media posted that humans are stories with bodies. Like storytelling is just so like integral to us. And like, I especially love this example that you gave where like there was like some sort of like ritualization and concretization, like that, like the story kind of interwove with like the material world in this like really magical way. And I
Yeah.
think, Taylor Swift is doing that and sharing like a magic with us. And you can say whatever the fuck you want about Taylor Swift, because I know like people are throwing shade on Taylor Swift these days around like, being a billionaire and like carbon emissions with the private jet and like being like a fragile white girl, all the things. Um, and I think there's this like age old story of like, how do you separate the art from the artist? And I will say like there is magic. There is magic in these stories. Like I don't care who is telling them. And
That's right.
and
That's it. It's a storyteller. She's a storyteller. That's her
well,
art.
in relationships, like to your point, like the way that we engage with Taylor Swift and what we project on Taylor Swift is as much as we want to make it about Taylor Swift is also like about us. And so like can we maybe like be honest about that? Um,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately
Yeah.
I think there's however, here's what I'll say. I hope people walk away from this conversation being really curious about how they engage with their stories, past, present, and future differently and more generatively and more magically.
I love that. And I think it's fun to open up just a possibility. Like, I think a lot of our conversation too opened up, like, where am I wanting somebody else to be different so that I am able to be myself?
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of our love stories are about. It's like, why wasn't this person who I wanted them to be? And it's like, I'm not God.
Yeah.
Why am I not taking care of myself? That
Why, why
why
did I
am I willing
send
to? And
away? Yeah.
yes,
Such an important
exactly. It's like
question.
what, yeah. So thank you so much. Yeah, I am
Okay, tell
at Molly Blue
everyone.
Wilder on Instagram. Yeah, at Molly Blue Wilder on Instagram.
Okay. Molly's an amazing coach, right? Like, do you have a coaching niche or do you have any coaching offers? I will say, like, I am very picky about who I work with, and I would work with you in a heartbeat. And it's always like like we haven't like formally worked together, but even the conversations we have are just, they're always, um, there's always something like so new and insightful and helpful that I get out of every single one. So, I personally cannot
I
recommend you
enjoy.
enough, honestly.
Thank you. I love talking to you. You can add my name to the list of people that want to see more of you and difference and all of that. Like, I just find you delightful. So thank
Hmm.
you for
Are
sharing
you
yourself with
you
me.
are still accepting one-on-one clients though, right? Or
I
yeah.
work, yep, one-on-one clients. I someday I'll have some other things going, and I might have some workshop ideas in the works, but right now, yeah, I'm one-on-one, and I work. Probably half my clients are in the process of divorce or considering divorce or post-divorce. About half my clients, and then the other half of my clients, I work a lot around like helping people navigate life change, whatever that might be, and the ways that our bodies have habitually been, and helping our bodies learn new ways to be, and supporting really like the somatic sensation of change. So those are kind of areas. And then, yeah, I just recently completed my hypnosis certification. So I work with a lot of trance and the unconscious to make that process a little more easeful. I
Oh my
won't say
gosh. Well, we
easy.
obviously need to have another conversation soon because I already have so many questions. But I will put, and you have a website, right? Like I'll put all the information in the show
Hmm.
notes. Wow, this was
Yep.
so fun. Oh my gosh.
Thanks, Celestina.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Okay. Bye, Molly. We'll talk soon.
Bye.